start somewhat shamelessly with my new book, where I highlight divergent but yet interwoven social projects that fairy tale adaptations in the early 21st century envision and instigate. In the book, I take an intertextual and geopolitical fairy tale web of reading and writing practices as my methodological field. And I argue that today's fairy tale transformations activate multiple intertextual and generic links that both expand and decenter the narrow conception of the genre fixed in Disneyfied pre-1970s popular cultural memory. I think all of the presentations we've heard substantiate and say this much better than I do. Proposing the fairy tale web as a general site for critical inquiry into the genre's activity has a twofold purpose: to envision current fairy tale cultural practices in an intertextual dialogue with one another, a dialogue that is informed not only by the interests of the entertainment culture and the dynamics of globalization in the so-called post-feminist climate, but also by more multivocal and unpredictable uses of the genre. And two, to further the construction of a history and remapping of the genre that take capitalism, colonialism, coloniality, and disciplinarity into account. As Christine Jones and Jennifer Shacker aptly describe it, the fairy tale web is tangled, its many tendrils interlock, and its patterns change depending on the vantage point from which in responding to this multivocality, I focus specifically on what I call activist adaptations. That is, variously situated responses that contest the hegemony of a colonizing, orientalizing, heteronormative, and commercialized poetics of magic. You can tell that I'm using magic or thinking about magic a little bit differently from the way that Martin was using magic tales earlier. I show that while they do not represent wonder or wonders, these adaptations work in different modes and media to cultivate our taste for wonder and attune us to its power in fairy tales. And I see these activist adaptations as potentially transformative of the fairy tale, a genre too often put to work hegemonically in globalized consumer popular culture. I say potentially transformative because the effects of activist adaptations depend also on our reading practices, our openness to forming a different habitus. For instance, if what is being tapped in activist adaptations so as to cultivate our sense of wonder is quite often the fictional tales meshing with local legends, emplaced knowledges, oratures that are activated to query the dominant fairy tale's poetic of magic, then, for scholars in fairy tale studies in particular, I believe a lot depends on our willingness to engage the question of how storytellers, adapters from varied locations of subaltern and colonial difference turn to the folk in fairy tale today for making the impossible possible, which is something that Nalo Hopkinson, spec fiction author of Taino Arawak and Afro-Caribbean descent, and many other artists do and also say they are doing. While the 21st century fairy tale web is complex and multimedial, not all its links are equal, since maintaining a socioeconomic and cultural divide is built into a for-profit, globalizing economy of cultural production. The current inequality, I underscore, extends to normative constructions of the fairy tale web's history and its geopolitics of knowledge. Historically, the traffic of folk and fairy tales has been regulated by commerce, religion, prejudice, which results in an unequal flow of tales and an unequal valorization of different tellers' located knowledges. If we see the intertextual web as a methodological field, by that I mean that the web is experienced in the activity of reading rather than as a received or pre-existing object, then it matters how, through the construction and reconstruction of a web of intertextuality, we make multiple histories of the genre visible, narratable, or not. This reconstruction of the web includes how we link fairy tales with folk tales, and how fairy tale texts become available in print or other media today for teaching in North America and elsewhere. Overall, my approach in the book is to pay attention to how certain activist fairy tale adaptations in different media relocate the genre from counter-hegemonic perspectives on orality and wonder, and to take note of how these reorienting practices suggest as a critical task that we remap the fairy tale as one among many wonder genres onto a worldly web. So that's kind of my larger framework. But today, I want to think through a challenge that reading fairy tales, their adaptations, and fairy tale studies as part of a worldly web poses. A reader of my book manuscript astutely suggested I address the impossibility of comparative fairy tale studies on a global scale. And this reader asked, how do we train the next generation of scholars? Do we still need specialists in national languages and literatures? Or will they be displaced by a new generation of scholars who think globally, even when it means sacrificing precision and depth? Good question. I'm not answering it, I'm just playing with it. Such questions bring home the importance in our scholarship of language skills and of specific cultural knowledges. I see how meeting the challenge of truly comparative fairy tale studies may never be a reality. But I'm not so much calling for comparativism as for remapping the fairy tale genre onto a worldly and not worldwide web. So what does this mean? Worldly. Worldly is not the same as worldly wise, which would mean pragmatic, street smart, opportunistic mindset trained in the way of a bustling, practical, material world. Rather, I'm of course referring to Edward Said's insistence on how all texts are worldly and circumstantial, advancing a particular perspective and bringing about consequences in the social world from which they can never be separate. Stories are worldly, Said writes, as they make their way in the world. And I found it particularly helpful to think about the worldliness of folktale and fairy tale adaptations through Walter Mignolo's anti-globalizing geopolitical framework that foregrounds the workings of coloniality as discursive building blocks for colonialism and capitalism. In her 2010 book, The Storytime of the British Empire, Colonial and Post-Colonial Folkloristics, Sadhna Naitani draws on this geopolitics of knowledge to show how colonial folklore studies was a central articulation of colonial culture, precisely because of the ways in which collecting and publishing the folktales of the colonized in India and Africa worked to support, at the turn of the 20th century, the grand narrative that the British Empire was telling of itself and its people, those who had writing and those who did not. Folktales from colonized India were making their way in the world as English language books, often labeled as fairy tales, that codified and reinforced the need not only for salvage folkloristics, but for colonialism and imperialism. What I like about Mignolo's approach is not only how he limns the place of orality in constituting what he calls the coloniality of power, but how he calls for a relocation of knowledge in the present from the perspective of local histories and colonial differences. That is what Naitani's project calls for too, and so does my work on English language colonial and anti-colonial translations of Native Hawaiian tales and histories at the turn of the 20th century. Mignolo and Naitani's critical insistence on coloniality helped me to really think about how folktales have, via processes of print publication and translation that are structured by a politics of inequality, made their way in the world, quite often garbed as fairy tales. This awareness helps also to strengthen links with approaches in fairy tale studies that do not rely on rigid oppositions and generalizations. as Donald Haase pointed out in Decolonizing Fairy Tale Studies, constructing a rigid literary history of the fairy tale and assuming that folktales are a universal and indigenous narrative form that guarantees cultural diversity are two sides of a discourse that ignores the material, ideological, and symbolic interdependence of these two genres, as well as the crucially transformative work that translation does in their transmission. That we pay closer attention to the politics of translation, then, is one of my answers to the questions of how to train the next generation of scholars. But the other side of this answer is that we should at the same time foster, in S. Shankar's words, a culture of translation. That is, a widely disseminated and rich understanding of translation that recognizes not only the pitfalls of translation as violence, but foregrounds the value of translation as interpretation and also as activism. And there is an important strand, I think, in translation studies now that really works with translation as activism. A decolonial and activist potential of translation is the specific focus of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, celebrated author of Decolonizing the Mind, and many novels in English and in Kikuyu that draw on oral traditions from his native Kenya. He advocates in his most recent critical book, Globalectics, for translation as a two-way traffic of ideas that would enable conversations among cultures and languages. That is what we think translation does, but not always, or not always. This work has inspired me, and I'd like to share why. Reminding us of how Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism perceived culture contact as oxygen, Ngugi wa Thiong'o underscores how, within a framework of globalectics, translation is crucial because it can spread decolonizing knowledge, as when translating enables conversations between marginalized or non-hegemonic languages, and also when it provides alternative cross-cultural connections in dominant or hegemonic languages that contest the legacy of colonialism. Thinking of translation as both imperialist and counter-hegemonic practice enables us to act on the imperative of becoming more responsible, able to the diversity of knowledge and artistic systems of stories across conceptual and cultural horizons. Published in 2012, Ngugi's Globalectics enacts colonial difference in ways that I've found particularly helpful in thinking about folktales and fairy tales making their way in the world, and in thinking about the scholarly tales we tell about them today. Significantly, Ngugi proposes his ideas as poor theory, which he says implies a critique of theory weighted down by ornaments and seeks to accord dignity to the poor as they fight poverty, including the poverty of theory. Now, fiction is a form of poor theory. As such, poor theory is quite familiar to storytellers, writers, adapters, folklorists, and makes good sense in fairy tale studies too. In 1990, Angela Carter, writer and revisionist of fairy tales, invited us to view folk and fairy tales stories from the oral traditions as poor theory that provides the most vital connection we have with the imaginations of the ordinary men and women whose labor created our world. Jack Zipes' work continues to develop this perspective. But in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's version of it, poor theory is further mapped onto a politics of place and ultimately affects how we approach the organization of literary space and its impact on the politics of knowledge, of knowing. For this reorganization, Ngugi wa Thiong'o invites us to think globalectically, which to me speaks directly to how the fairy tale web offers a methodological alternative to the problem of choosing between working in a national tradition and theorizing globally. I quote, "Globalectics combines the global and the dialectical to describe a mutually affecting dialogue or multilogue in the phenomenon of nature and nurture in a global space that's rapidly transcending that of the artificially bounded as nation or region. Derived from the shape of the globe, and in this sense, this is close to Spivak's notion of planetarity, but it's cast in Orthian language. Globalectics has no single or predetermined center. A decolonizing way of relating to the world in an era of globalization, it emerges specifically from the colony, Ngugi's experience at the University of Nairobi in the 60s. And it embraces, I'm quoting here, interconnectedness, equality of potentiality of parts, tension and motion, in the interest of an aesthetics of decolonization. So to think globalectically of folk and fairy tales making their way in the world always starts here. Wherever that here is and whatever our positionality within that space or place is. It starts here in order to consider the tensions with there and movements to and back from there in order to trace mutual change. Just as each here relates to multiple theirs, here is not simple or easily accessible. For instance, whatever our position in a colonized or post-colonial place where language, memory, education were turned against place-based ways of knowing, here can be in no simple opposition to there. But starting from the here that was overwritten and devalued is then all the more important. What from here to there suggests in Ngugi Bationgo's poor theory is that one cannot and should not escape the politics of relation, its interconnectedness and tension, the movement from the here of specific narrative and linguistic traditions to their global circulation and the space they occupy in world literature, and then the movement back to here. It is to read the global circulation, for instance, of folktales since the 15th century and into the present as hinging on the spread of colonialism and capitalism, but also to approach tales and people in the spirit of reciprocity, of finding a relationship to what we do not know. And I think that's crucial to the whole idea of how reciprocity can be even envisioned. Specifically relevant to folk and fairy tale studies today is how Ngugi links the project of globalectics to taking into account the interlinked nature of art forms in traditional practice, and to unmaking the hierarchy that has devalued orature in order to valorize a particular kind of literature. Ngugi foregrounds the need to reconnect with the natural alliance of orature and literature, an alliance that many indigenous and post-colonial fiction makers and scholars also emphasize. It further speaks to today's convergence culture, some of you alluded to that, where orality is mediated by writing in cyberspace, and where we are, in Ngugi's words, experiencing the emergence of cyborature. To explore and study the interconnectivity of oratures, literatures, and cyboratures in ways that counter hierarchical ideologies and account for complexities of anti-colonial aesthetics in a globalized world, Ngugi proposes the networking approach of globalectics, where old and new technologies, as well as hegemonic and counter-hegemonic knowledge systems, are not in harmony with one another, but are approached in a web of connections, of mutual dependence. Just as Cherokee writer and theorist Thomas King states that the distinction of native literatures lies in their ways of knowing the world and connecting with it, for Ngugi, an interactive mutuality between the various realms of being informs the oratures of the world, a mutuality that capitalism and consumer culture have sought to sever, and a world-making and knowledge system which some contemporary activist adaptations of fairy tales seek to reconnect us with. So to conclude today's presentation, addressing the question, how do we train the next generation of scholars in ways that are cognizant of the worldliness of folk and fairy tales? My provisional answers are that we pay attention to the politics of translation, that we cultivate a culture of translation, and that we learn to think globalectically working to undermine the orature and literature hierarchy that continues to sustain other forms of social inequality today. I welcome your thoughts and responses. Thanks. Here's my bibliography.